I was a cashier accused of stealing until I exposed the manager's embezzlement, but that moment of vindication felt like a lifetime away as I sat in the cramped back office watching Regional Manager Harrison flip through the security footage one more time, his thick fingers stabbing at the rewind button with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done this before. The fluorescent light above us flickered with that stuttering rhythm that had driven me crazy for 8 months of working at Peterson's Electronics, casting harsh shadows across Harrison's weathered face as he squinted at the grainy black and white monitor. My hands remained folded in my lap, fingers interlaced to stop them from shaking, not from fear, but from the slow-burning rage that had been building since Manager Bradley Chen first pulled me aside 3 hours ago with that practiced look of disappointed authority. Chen sat beside Harrison like a loyal dog, occasionally pointing at the screen with theatrical concern, his wedding ring catching the harsh light each time he gestured. I'd watched him perfect this performance over the past few weeks, the way he'd furrow his brow and shake his head whenever the topic of missing inventory came up during staff meetings. The missing inventory that had somehow become my problem. The footage showed me at Register 3 during Tuesday's closing shift, handling the cash drawer with the same methodical care I'd used every night for 8 months. Count the 20s, stack the 10s, bundle the 5s and 1s, enter the total into the system. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Yet somehow, according to Chen's carefully maintained records, $73 had vanished from that very drawer between my count and the morning deposit. Harrison paused the video and leaned back in his chair, the springs creaking under his weight. His eyes moved from the screen to me, conducting some internal calculation that I could read in the slight downturn of his mouth. Chen cleared his throat, a small, wet sound that made my skin crawl, and reached for a manila folder thick with documentation. The papers spread across the desk told a story that would have been convincing if I hadn't been living it from the inside. Chen had assembled a timeline spanning 3 weeks, each incident carefully noted in his precise handwriting. September 15th, register 2 short $42 after my shift. September 22nd, register 1 missing $68 following my closing duties. September 29th, register 3 short $73 after my count. I studied Chen's face as Harrison reviewed the documentation, noting the subtle tension around his eyes, the way his left hand absently rubbed his thumb against his fingertips, a nervous habit I'd observed during the monthly budget meetings when corporate called with questions about store performance. The same tell he'd shown when explaining the discrepancies in our inventory reports to the district supervisor last month. Harrison closed the folder and looked at me with the weary expression of a man who'd had this conversation too many times before. His mouth moved in what I assumed were the standard phrases: company policy, zero tolerance, disappointing situation, clean record until recently. I nodded at appropriate intervals, maintaining eye contact, letting him see the confused hurt I genuinely felt at being falsely accused. But beneath that hurt, something colder had begun to crystallize. As Harrison droned through the termination procedures, I found myself studying Chen with new interest, remembering fragments of conversations, observing details I'd previously dismissed as insignificant quirks of management. The way Chen always volunteered to handle the cash deposits personally, insisting he didn't mind the early morning bank runs that kept him off the sales floor during busy periods. His reluctance to let anyone else access the safe combination, claiming corporate preferred limited access for security reasons. The expensive watch that had appeared on his wrist 6 weeks ago, a Rolex Submariner that retailed for more than his annual salary, which he'd brushed off as an anniversary gift from his wife when I complimented it. Harrison slid a paper across the desk, my final paycheck, already processed, missing 2 days of wages for the alleged theft. I signed the termination paperwork with steady hands, each signature a small act of compliance that masked the calculating fury building behind my carefully neutral expression. Chen walked me to my locker with what he probably thought was appropriate solemnity, his shoes squeaking against the polished floor of the break room. I gathered my belongings slowly, a coffee mug, a small plant, a paperback book, while Chen hovered nearby, radiating the nervous energy of someone trying to appear sympathetic while hiding relief. As I cleaned out the narrow metal compartment, my fingers brushed against something I'd forgotten, a small digital recorder I'd bought months ago to practice Spanish lessons during my lunch breaks. The device had been sitting unused behind my spare uniform shirt, but now it felt significant in my palm, solid and purposeful. Chen cleared his throat again and shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly anxious to finish this unpleasant business. I took my time folding my spare apron, letting the silence stretch between us, watching him fidget with his keyring. When I finally closed the locker door, the metallic clang echoed through the empty break room like a starting gun. The parking lot was nearly empty in the late afternoon sun, just a few employee cars scattered across the weathered asphalt. I sat in my Honda Civic for several minutes after leaving the store, not moving, just thinking. The small recorder sat on my dashboard where I'd placed it, its presence somehow reassuring as I began to process what had just happened. 8 months of reliable service, perfect attendance, positive customer feedback, all of it dismissed because of 3 carefully documented incidents that painted me as a petty thief. The precision of it bothered me more than the accusation itself. Chen hadn't just fired me, he'd constructed an entire narrative to justify my termination. I started the engine and drove home slowly, taking the long route through downtown, using the time to examine my memories of the past few weeks with new clarity. Chen's behavior had changed recently, becoming more secretive, more controlling of the daily operations that he'd previously delegated to senior staff members. The promotion opportunity that had opened up at the Westside location, Chen had been enthusiastic about recommending me for the position until suddenly, without explanation, he'd stopped mentioning it entirely. The timing coincided perfectly with the first reported cash shortage, I realized now. My apartment felt smaller than usual when I finally arrived home, the walls seeming to press closer as I paced between the kitchen and living room, replaying the day's events. I set the recorder on my coffee table and stared at it while I made dinner, my mind working through possibilities and connections. Chen's wife worked at First National Bank on Elm Street. I remembered him mentioning it during casual break room conversations. She handled commercial accounts, he'd said with obvious pride, dealing with local businesses and their banking needs. Peterson's Electronics banked at First National. Chen made the daily deposits there personally. I ate my dinner methodically, chewing slowly while I considered the implications. If Chen was skimming cash from the registers, he'd need a way to cover the shortfalls in the deposit records. Having a wife with access to commercial banking systems would make such manipulation significantly easier. The Rolex had appeared around the same time the cash shortages began. A coincidence perhaps, but an expensive one. I pulled out my laptop and spent the evening researching the watch model, confirming the retail price and learning about its distinctive features. The serial number would be engraved on the case, traceable through Rolex's warranty database if anyone cared to look. Over the following days, I developed a routine. Each morning, I'd drive to the Peterson's Electronics parking lot and sit in my car, ostensibly reading job listings on my phone while actually observing the patterns of daily operation. I learned that Chen arrived 30 minutes before opening, always parking in the same spot near the employee entrance. He left for the bank deposit around 10:30 each morning, returning within 45 minutes. I followed him twice, maintaining a careful distance as he drove the familiar route to First National Bank. Both times, he parked in the customer lot and disappeared inside for approximately 15 minutes, longer than necessary for a simple deposit, but reasonable if he was conducting additional business. On Thursday morning, I positioned myself across the street from the bank with a clear view of the parking lot. Chen arrived at his usual time, but instead of heading directly into the building, he sat in his car for several minutes, apparently making phone calls. When he finally emerged, he walked not to the main customer entrance, but to the employee entrance on the side of the building. The pieces were beginning to form a recognizable pattern. Chen wasn't just making deposits, he was coordinating with his wife to manipulate the records, creating artificial shortfalls that justified terminating employees who might notice discrepancies in store operations. I needed proof, but obtaining it would require patience and careful planning. Chen had been methodical in framing me. I would need to be equally methodical in exposing him. That evening, I called my former coworker Janet, who'd been working at Peterson's for 3 years and had always been friendly. I expressed confusion about my termination, mentioning that I'd been hoping to get a reference for job applications. Her voice carried genuine sympathy as she shared what she'd heard through the workplace gossip network. 2 other employees had been terminated for cash shortages in the past 6 months, she revealed. Both had been good workers with clean records until suddenly they weren't. Both had been close to receiving promotion opportunities or raises that would have given them more access to store operations. Janet also mentioned something interesting. Chen had been pressuring the remaining staff to handle closing procedures more quickly, discouraging the double counting of cash drawers that had previously been standard practice. Speed and efficiency, he called it, claiming corporate wanted streamlined operations. After hanging up, I spent hours researching employee theft cases, learning how embezzlement schemes typically operated and what evidence would be necessary to prove wrongdoing. The pattern was always similar: create an atmosphere of suspicion, eliminate potential witnesses through manufactured incidents, and maintain control over the financial processes that could expose the scheme. I needed access to information that would normally be restricted to management and corporate oversight. Chen's computer would contain records of cash deposits, inventory reports, and employee performance evaluations that could reveal the systematic nature of his scheme. The solution came to me while I was reviewing Peterson's electronics employee handbook, which I'd kept as reference for unemployment filing purposes. The document outlined the company's policies for handling suspected employee misconduct, including provisions for anonymous reporting of suspicious activities to corporate headquarters. I crafted my approach carefully, positioning myself not as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge, but as a concerned citizen who'd noticed suspicious patterns in the store's operations. The anonymous tip I submitted to corporate focused on discrepancies between reported cash shortages and employee terminations, suggesting that someone with managerial authority might be manipulating records. Within 2 days, I received a callback from corporate security, requesting additional details about my observations. I provided specific dates and amounts, always framing my knowledge as information gathered through casual observation as a frequent customer. The security investigators seemed genuinely interested, particularly when I mentioned the correlation between employee terminations and the timing of cash shortage reports. Corporate launched a quiet investigation, sending an auditor to review the store's financial records without Chen's advance knowledge. I learned about this development through Janet, who mentioned that a stern-looking woman with a briefcase had spent an entire day going through paperwork in the back office while Chen paced nervously around the sales floor. The auditor's visit was followed by increased corporate oversight. Regional Manager Harrison began making unannounced visits, arriving at random times to observe operations and review daily procedures. Chen's nervous energy became more pronounced, his usual confident demeanor replaced by fidgety anxiety that his staff couldn't help but notice. I maintained my surveillance routine, documenting Chen's daily banking trips and noting any changes in his behavior patterns. On the Tuesday following the corporate audit, he deviated from his usual routine, making 2 separate trips to the bank instead of his normal single morning deposit. The first trip occurred at the usual time, but the second happened during his lunch break, and he took a different route through downtown. I followed at a distance, watching as he parked not at First National Bank, but at a small credit union several blocks away. He emerged 15 minutes later carrying a manila envelope, his body language tense and hurried. That evening, I researched the credit union and discovered that his wife had previously worked there before joining First National. The connection suggested that Chen was diversifying his financial manipulations, possibly moving money between accounts to complicate any potential investigation. I decided to accelerate my timeline. The corporate investigation would eventually uncover Chen's scheme, but I wanted to ensure that the full scope of his fraud was exposed, including the systematic termination of employees who might notice discrepancies. The opportunity came when Janet mentioned that Chen would be attending a regional managers conference the following weekend, leaving the store under the supervision of the assistant manager. Corporate had scheduled a comprehensive inventory audit during his absence, a timing that seemed deliberately planned to catch any discrepancies while Chen couldn't interfere. I spent that weekend documenting every piece of information I'd gathered, creating a detailed timeline that connected Chen's behavior patterns to the cash shortages and employee terminations. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, painting a clear picture of systematic embezzlement disguised as employee theft. On Monday morning, I submitted a formal complaint to the district attorney's office, providing copies of my documentation along with a detailed explanation of Chen's scheme. I identified myself as a terminated employee, but emphasized that my concerns were primarily about the fraudulent accusations made against other workers who'd lost their jobs. The DA's office contacted corporate security the same day, requesting access to Peterson's financial records as part of a criminal investigation. Chen arrived at work to find 2 investigators waiting in the parking lot, along with Regional Manager Harrison and a representative from Corporate Legal Department. I watched from across the street as Chen's face went pale, his usual confident posture collapsing as the investigators introduced themselves. His hands trembled slightly as he unlocked the store entrance, glancing repeatedly toward the bank as if calculating whether he had time to make one final transaction. The investigation moved quickly once it began in earnest. Corporate's forensic accountant discovered systematic discrepancies in the deposit records, with actual bank statements showing smaller amounts than the store's internal documentation reported. The shortfalls totaled more than $12,000 over 8 months, far more than the few $100s that had been attributed to employee theft. Chen's wife was suspended from her position at First National Bank, pending a separate investigation into her role in manipulating deposit records. The Rolex disappeared from Chen's wrist, though he claimed during questioning that he'd sold it to cover unexpected medical expenses. The investigators interviewed all the employees who'd been terminated for cash shortages, including myself. We compared our experiences and discovered that Chen had used nearly identical tactics in each case, creating documentation that appeared thorough while actually manufacturing evidence of theft. 2 weeks after the investigation began, Chen was arrested at his home during the early morning hours. The charges included embezzlement, fraud, and filing false reports, felonies that carried potential prison sentences of several years each. I received a phone call from Regional Manager Harrison the day after Chen's arrest. His voice carried a mixture of embarrassment and relief as he offered to reinstate my employment and provide back pay for the period following my wrongful termination. He also mentioned that corporate was implementing new oversight procedures to prevent similar incidents in the future. I accepted the reinstatement but declined to return to the same store location. Instead, I requested a transfer to the West Side location, the promotion opportunity that Chen had originally supported before his scheme required my elimination as a potential witness. The trial took place 6 months later. I testified about my observations of Chen's behavior patterns, the suspicious timing of cash shortages, and the systematic nature of employee terminations. The prosecutor presented bank records showing that Chen and his wife had diverted nearly $15,000 from store deposits over the course of 10 months. Chen's defense attorney argued that the missing money resulted from sloppy bookkeeping rather than intentional fraud, but the pattern of evidence was too consistent to support that theory. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. During the sentencing hearing, I had the opportunity to address the court about the impact of Chen's actions. I spoke not only about my own wrongful termination, but about the other employees who'd lost their jobs and suffered damage to their reputations based on fabricated accusations. Judge Morrison sentenced Chen to 4 years in prison and ordered restitution of the full amount stolen, plus damages for the wrongfully terminated employees. His wife received 2 years of probation and community service for her role in manipulating the banking records. Peterson's Electronics implemented new security protocols requiring dual authorization for all cash handling procedures and regular audits by independent accounting firms. Regional Manager Harrison personally apologized to each of the wrongfully terminated employees and provided letters of recommendation to help repair any damage to their employment prospects. I kept the small digital recorder that had started this investigation, though I never did use it to practice Spanish. It sits on my desk at the West Side store, where I now work as assistant manager, serving as a reminder that sometimes the most effective revenge is simply ensuring that the truth eventually comes to light. The promotion came with a significant salary increase and comprehensive benefits, along with the satisfaction of knowing that my patience and methodical approach had not only cleared my name, but prevented Chen from victimizing future employees. His scheme had relied on the assumption that accused workers would accept their termination quietly, rather than challenging the documentation he'd so carefully constructed. Chen served 32 months of his sentence before being released on parole. I heard through Janet, who'd remained at the original store location, that he'd found work at a small auto parts shop on the other side of town, a job that didn't involve handling money or supervising other employees. His wife managed to keep her banking career, though she'd been transferred to a branch in a different city and no longer handled commercial accounts. The Rolex, according to court records, had indeed been sold, but to pay for legal fees rather than medical expenses, as Chen had originally claimed. The other employees who'd been wrongfully terminated all found new positions, several of them receiving promotions and salary increases that reflected their actual capabilities rather than the fraudulent performance evaluations Chen had used to justify their dismissal. I sometimes drive past the original Peterson's Electronics location during my lunch breaks, noting the changes that have been implemented since Chen's departure. The store seems busier now, with higher employee morale and more efficient operations under management that doesn't need to manufacture crises to hide embezzlement. The fluorescent light in the back office has been replaced with LED fixtures that don't flicker, a small improvement that somehow symbolizes the broader changes in the store's atmosphere. Employees no longer walk on eggshells around closing procedures, and the cash handling protocols have been streamlined for both efficiency and accountability. Justice, I learned, doesn't always arrive quickly, but it can be remarkably thorough when pursued with patience and attention to detail. Chen's attempt to destroy my reputation had backfired completely, ultimately exposing a fraud scheme that might have continued for years if he'd chosen different victims. The experience taught me valuable lessons about the importance of documentation, the power of systematic observation, and the satisfaction that comes from allowing criminals to destroy themselves through their own arrogance and overconfidence. Chen had been so focused on covering his tracks and eliminating potential witnesses that he'd failed to consider the possibility that his victims might fight back with the same methodical approach he'd used to frame them. His downfall came not from a moment of carelessness, but from the accumulated weight of evidence that proved his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. I kept copies of all the documentation from the investigation, not out of vindictiveness, but as a reminder of how important it is to stand up for the truth, even when the odds seem overwhelming. The small recorder on my desk serves the same purpose, a symbol of the moment when I decided to fight back rather than accept an injustice quietly. The promotion to assistant manager brought new responsibilities and challenges, but also the satisfaction of knowing that I'd earned the position through merit rather than manipulation. The employees I now supervise can trust that their performance evaluations are based on actual work quality, not manufactured crises designed to eliminate potential threats. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd simply accepted the termination and moved on to another job without investigating Chen's scheme. He might still be stealing from Peterson's Electronics, and other innocent employees might still be losing their jobs based on fabricated accusations. The thought reinforces my conviction that the methodical pursuit of justice, no matter how long it takes, is always preferable to the quick satisfaction of immediate revenge. Chen's punishment came not from any action I took against him directly, but from his own criminal behavior finally catching up with him. His downfall was complete and permanent. A prison sentence, a criminal record, and a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his career. The contrast with my own situation couldn't be more stark. I'd emerged from his attempt to destroy me with a better job, higher salary, and the respect of colleagues who knew the truth about what had happened. The recorder still sits on my desk, no longer serving any investigative purpose, but remaining as a reminder that patience, documentation, and systematic observation can be more powerful than any direct confrontation. Chen had tried to eliminate me as a threat, but his efforts had only strengthened my resolve and provided the motivation necessary to expose his crimes. In the end, the best revenge had proven to be the simple act of ensuring that a criminal faced the consequences of his actions. Chen's scheme had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, and justice had been served not through any desire for personal vengeance, but through the methodical pursuit of truth. The satisfaction I felt watching him led away in handcuffs was not the hot anger of immediate retaliation, but the cold contentment that comes from knowing that a wrong has been made right through proper channels and careful documentation. His fall from respected manager to convicted felon had been complete, thorough, and entirely self-inflicted. That recorder would remain on my desk as long as I worked at Peterson's Electronics, a small but significant reminder that sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply allowing criminals to face the natural consequences of their own actions.